A struggling single mother, hawking noodles on the sun-drenched streets of Lagos to survive, shows mercy to a disguised old man, only to discover he is the patriarch of a multi-billion-dollar empire who remembers her kindness when his own memory is fading. The sun was beginning its slow descent over the chaotic sprawl of Lagos, casting a golden, hazy light over the endless rows of market stalls and yellow Danfo buses. The sounds of the city, the rhythmic honking of horns, the aggressive shouts of street hawkers, and the constant hum of generators, formed the unrelenting backdrop to Esther's modest roadside kiosk. For 6 long years, she had poured her soul into this small space, serving steaming bowls of spicy noodles to hurried commuters and neighborhood families. The air was thick with the scent of exhaust and dust, but the rich, peppery aroma from her sizzling pots of broth continued to pull in hungry customers from the thick of the midday traffic. Esther wiped the perspiration from her forehead with the edge of her stained apron, adjusting the weight of baby Mary, who was strapped securely to her back in a faded but clean Ankara wrapper. The child's steady breathing against her spine was the only thing that kept her hands moving when the fatigue threatened to buckle her knees. A faint, weary smile touched her lips as she handed a steaming bowl to a waiting laborer, but behind her tired, observant eyes lay the history of a woman who had weathered storms that would have broken most. She had once been the star of her fashion design cohort at a prestigious university in Accra, attending on a hard-won scholarship that felt like a golden ticket out of poverty. Orphaned early in life, she had spent years bouncing through foster homes, her talent for sketching and sewing serving as her only anchor. But that dream had shattered the moment her university boyfriend, the only person she had ever truly leaned on, vanished into thin air upon learning she was pregnant. Left with no support and a child to feed, Esther had traded her delicate silk fabrics for a wooden cart and a heavy stove, burying her sketches beneath bags of flour and spices just to survive. If you're just tuning into this channel, please subscribe, give this video a thumbs up, and don't forget to share with your friends and family, and tell us where you're watching from in the comments section. The dusty haze of the afternoon rush was beginning to settle over the road as Esther handed over the last of her takeaway packs. Amidst the cacophony of shouting bus conductors and the grinding gears of heavy trucks, a lone figure detached itself from the crowd. It was an elderly man, his steps heavy and uncertain, wearing a worn red beanie that sat lopsided on his head. He stopped near the edge of Esther's kiosk, his eyes darting back and forth with a vacant, haunted look that spoke of a mind lost in its own fog. To the passing commuters, he looked like just another trash picker or a wanderer without a home, but Esther felt a familiar tug in her chest. With Mary still sleeping soundly against her back, Esther stepped around the sizzling pots and approached him gently. "Papa, are you looking for someone?" she asked softly, her voice barely a whisper against the city's roar. The man blinked at her, his hands trembling as they clutched the edges of his faded green shirt. I think I was going home," he muttered, his voice raspy and thin. "But the streets have changed. Everything looks different now." Esther didn't see a nuisance or a beggar. She saw a grandfather who deserved a moment of peace. She guided him to her only plastic chair, the one she usually saved for her daughter. "Sit here, Papa. Let me give you something hot to eat." The old man looked down at his empty, weathered palms. "I have no naira to give you, daughter," he said, a flash of quiet dignity crossing his face. Esther smiled, a genuine warmth reaching her eyes. "You don't need money today. Just eat." She returned to the stove, quickly tossing fresh vegetables and meat into a bowl of seasoned noodles, the steam rising like an offering. As the man began to eat with slow, deliberate spoonfuls, the atmosphere around the stall suddenly shifted. The screech of tires on gravel announced the arrival of a sleek black SUV that looked entirely out of place in the dusty market. A young man, Victor, stepped out with a face tight with panic, his eyes scanning the sidewalk until they landed on the old man. He rushed forward, falling to his knees beside the chair. "Grandpa, why did you wander off again?" Victor breathed, his voice thick with relief. The old man looked up and smiled, his memory momentarily sparking as he patted Esther's arm. "Michael, this woman. She was kind," he whispered. "She gave me a place to rest." Victor stood, his striking presence commanding the attention of the onlookers as he turned toward Esther with eyes full of deep, unspoken gratitude. The car ride to the gated residence in the lush, quiet corner of Victoria Island felt like a journey into a different dimension for Esther. As the sleek black SUV glided over the smooth pavement, leaving the chaotic noise of mainland Lagos behind, Mary sat in the back seat, her eyes wide as she pressed her face against the window. Esther smoothed the fabric of her best dress, her fingers tracing the sunflowers she had embroidered along the hem, trying to steady the frantic beating of her heart. When they reached the towering four-story townhouse with its floor-to-ceiling windows and perfectly manicured hedges, the security guards gave a respectful nod, signaling that they were expected. Victor stood at the massive front door, his usual sharp suit replaced by a soft navy sweater that made him look approachable and warm. "You made it," he said, his voice a gentle anchor in the sea of Esther's nerves. Stepping inside, Esther felt the cool breath of the air conditioner and the subtle scent of lemon and cedarwood. The interior was a masterpiece of minimal elegance, far removed from the dust and heat of her roadside stall. In the center of the sun-drenched living room, seated in a plush leather armchair, was the man she knew only as a hungry stranger. Grandpa looked different today, cleaner, dressed in fine linen, with a blanket draped over his knees, but his eyes still held that flicker of disorientation. However, the moment Esther stepped into his line of sight, a miraculous change took place. The fog of dementia seemed to lift, replaced by a sharp, joyful clarity. "Well, if it isn't my noodle angel," he exclaimed, his voice ringing with a strength that surprised even Victor. While Mary hopped onto a stool to chat with the old man as if they were lifelong friends, Victor leaned in and whispered to Esther that she was the first person his grandfather had remembered so clearly in months. Grandpa's laughter echoed through the hall as he watched Esther, his gaze filled with a quiet, knowing dignity. "You are a good woman, Esther," he said firmly, reaching out to touch her arm. "Victor needs someone like you, someone strong and kind." In that moment, amidst the luxury of the island mansion, Esther realized that this connection was no longer just about a bowl of noodles. It was the beginning of a story she was finally brave enough to write. The heavy, humid air of the afternoon hung over the Lagos streets, but the usual comfort of the marketplace was pierced by the sharp, authoritative click of expensive heels against the uneven pavement. Esther was in the middle of her rush, moving with the rhythmic precision of a woman who had mastered survival, when the crowd near her kiosk parted as if intimidated. A woman stepped out of a sleek black vehicle, looking entirely out of place amidst the dust and the aroma of sizzling spices. Her makeup was a flawless mask of professional perfection, and her handbag likely cost more than Esther's entire inventory. This was Anita Johnson, a family associate of the Whitakers, and the coldness in her gaze immediately told Esther that this was not a social call. Anita did not sit. She stood with a rigid authority, her eyes sweeping over the modest noodle stand with visible disdain before settling on little Mary, who was playing quietly nearby. Without a hint of warmth, she extended a hand that felt firm and ice-cold, introducing herself as someone who looked after the Whitaker family's interests. She spoke of Esther's recent visit to the family mansion as a misunderstanding of kindness, her voice dripping with a condescension that made Esther's chest tighten. Anita's message was clear. Men like Victor lived in a world of glass and steel, and a roadside vendor was merely a temporary distraction for a grandfather with a fading memory. The air grew still as Anita reached into her designer bag and produced a thick, cream-colored envelope, sliding it across the wooden counter with a flick of her wrist. It was hush money, a calculated bribe intended to ensure Esther and Mary vanished back into the anonymity of the slums. Anita warned her that getting her hopes up would only lead to a heartbreak that her daughter would have to witness. Despite the intimidation, Esther did not flinch. She looked at the envelope and then back at the woman whose wealth could not hide her malice. Esther calmly informed Ms. Johnson that she knew exactly how to take care of herself and her child, leaving the bribe untouched on the table. Anita's eyes narrowed into slits of fury as she turned to leave. The silent war between the skyscraper and the street finally declared. The humid Tuesday afternoon in the heart of Lagos was thick with the usual frenzy of the market, but for Esther, a cold dread began to settle in her chest long before the black sedan pulled up. She was in the middle of her peak rush, the charcoal fire glowing under her pots, when two men in crisp, plain-clothed attire stepped out of the vehicle. They didn't come with the hunger of her usual customers. They came with the stiff, predatory gait of men looking for a reason to destroy. One man flashed a badge from the Department of Health, while the other clutched a clipboard as if it were a weapon. "Esther Daniels?" The one with the badge barked, his eyes scanning the modest wooden cart with practiced disdain. "Yes, that is me," Esther replied, her voice steady despite the sudden tightness in her throat. She reached back instinctively, checking the knot of the Ankara wrapper that held Mary safely against her spine. The man with the clipboard didn't wait for an invitation. He began lifting the lids of her stainless steel pots, letting the steam escape into the dusty air. "We received an anonymous complaint regarding severe food safety violations," he muttered, scribbling furiously. He listed a litany of fabrications: contaminated ingredients, improper storage, and unlicensed preparation, that felt like physical blows to Esther. She protested, pointing to her scrubbed surfaces and fresh vegetables, but her words were ignored as they poked through her personal belongings and even checked the trash. Nearby, the fruit vendors whispered, their eyes darting toward the scene, fueling the gossip Anita Johnson had already set in motion. Within 20 minutes, the men handed Esther a formal violation notice that felt like a death sentence. "You are to shut down immediately until a formal hearing," the man said coldly, oblivious to the fact that he was extinguishing her only means of survival. Esther stood frozen as they walked away, the bustling market suddenly feeling like a hollow, silent tomb. Mary, sensing her mother's distress, began to whimpering against her back. Esther knelt in the dirt, clutching her daughter tightly through the fabric. She knew this wasn't about hygiene or law. It was a calculated strike from the shadows of Victoria Island, meant to remind her that in the eyes of the elite, she was nothing more than a nuisance to be cleared from the pavement. The heavy glass doors of the Westbridge Group headquarters felt like a portal into another dimension as Esther stepped through them, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. For years, her hands had been stained with the turmeric and chili of her noodle stall, but today, they gripped the edges of a worn portfolio containing the ghosts of her Ghanaian scholarship days. Beside her, Mary was uncharacteristically quiet, her wide eyes reflecting the polished marble floors of the midtown skyscraper. Victor met them in the lobby, his presence a stabilizing force amidst the whirlwind of corporate activity. He didn't see a roadside vendor, but a visionary waiting for her moment. He led them into a brightly lit conference room where Loveth and Natasha waited. Loveth, the head of the fashion incubation program, exuded a regal, effortless authority that made Esther instinctively want to hide her calloused fingers. Natasha, a creative director with a sharp eye for detail, took the portfolio without a word. The silence that followed was agonizing as the two women flipped through sketches of high-waisted Ankara trousers, structured bodices, and fluid silk wraps that told the story of a modern Africa. Finally, Natasha looked up, a soft smile breaking her professional mask. She noted that the designs possessed a unique soul, a story that was missing from the work of designers who had never known hunger. Loveth confirmed there was a mentorship slot opening up, a competitive opportunity that could change everything, and she invited Esther to take it. Esther felt a rush of heat to her cheeks as she whispered her acceptance, the weight of 6 years of struggle suddenly feeling lighter. Victor then guided her to a separate wing of the building, sliding a small velvet box across the table that contained a silver key. It wasn't just a gesture of support, it was the key to a fully equipped private studio downtown, a sanctuary where she could build her label, Adira, away from the prying eyes of the street and the malice of those who wished to see her fail. Looking at the professional sewing machines and the rolls of premium fabric, Esther realized the future was no longer just something to survive, it was something she could finally shape with her own hands. The heavy, humid air of the Lagos market pressed down on Esther as she navigated the narrow corridors between stalls, her hand gripped tightly around Mary's small fingers. Usually, the vibrant chaos of the marketplace felt like home, but today, a prickle of unease danced along her spine. She was returning from the mentorship studio, her mind still buzzing with Natasha's feedback on her latest Adira sketches, but her primary focus remained on getting Mary home before the evening rain. They were just a few blocks from their apartment complex when the rhythmic pulse of the market was shattered by the screech of tires. A dark SUV, its windows tinted to a void-like black, veered toward the curb, forcing pedestrians to scatter. Before Esther could process the danger, the doors swung open, and two broad-shouldered men in heavy jackets lunged directly toward Mary. A primal scream tore from Esther's throat as she threw her body over her daughter, her fingernails digging into the earth as she fought to keep the child anchored to her. "Get away from her!" she shrieked, her voice cracking with a desperation that silenced the nearby vendors. One man reached for Mary's arm, his grip cold and iron-like, but a nearby fruit seller, sensing the foul play, swung a heavy wooden plank toward the attackers. The sudden interference of the crowd forced the men to hesitate. They exchanged a panicked look, retreated into the vehicle, and sped off into the thickening traffic. Esther collapsed onto the pavement, pulling a sobbing Mary into her lap, her own heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. When the police finally arrived to take her statement, Esther's hands wouldn't stop shaking. She knew this was no random street crime. That night, after a frantic phone call, Victor arrived with a grim expression and a team of private security. He knelt beside Esther, his voice a low, steady anchor in the storm of her fear. "I underestimated Anita's malice," he admitted, his jaw tight with a quiet fury. He didn't ask for her permission. He simply began packing their essentials. "You are moving into my penthouse tonight," he stated firmly, his eyes meeting hers with a protective intensity that made her feel, for the first time in years, that she didn't have to fight the world alone. The tension inside the high-rise studio was thick enough to choke the creative spark Esther had fought so hard to rekindle. With the Pan-African Fashion Expo only 48 hours away, the finishing touches on her Adira collection, a vibrant fusion of her Ghanaian roots and Lagosian grit, were finally complete. She had spent the last several nights hunched over a sewing machine in the space Victor provided, her fingers calloused but her heart light with a hope she hadn't felt since her scholarship days in Accra. However, that hope was a fragile thing in the face of Anita Johnson's cold, calculated envy. Under the cover of a rainy Lagos night, the betrayal took physical form. Kelvin, a senior staffer who had long harbored resentment toward the Whitaker family's sudden interest in a noodle seller, slipped into the studio with a set of keys provided by Anita. Working in a feverish, silent rage, he followed Anita's instructions to ensure Esther would have nothing to show the world. With sharp shears and jagged blades, they fell upon the mannequins. The hand-woven silks were sliced into ribbons, and the intricate Ankara embroidery was shredded until the floor was a graveyard of colorful fabric and broken dreams. Even a small drawing Mary had made for her mother was pinned to the wall with a cruel, mocking slash through the center. When Esther arrived the next morning, the sight of the carnage stole the breath from her lungs. She collapsed onto her knees amidst the ruins of her hard work. But the nightmare was only beginning. As Victor rushed to her side, his phone chimed with a notification that sent a fresh wave of nausea through the room. A prominent gossip blog had just exposed Esther, publishing a smear campaign that painted her as a manipulative social climber who had used a senile old man to sleep her way into the Whitaker fortune. The comments were a wildfire of judgment, calling her a fraud and demanding she be removed from the expo lineup. Anita's plan was nearly complete: destroy the work, then destroy the woman. Yet, as Esther looked at the shredded remains of her collection, a spark of the old survivalist fire returned to her eyes. They had taken her fabric, but they could not take the story she was born to tell. The backstage area of the Pan-African Fashion Expo was a controlled hurricane of silk, frantic whispers, and the sharp scent of hairspray. Esther stood at the center of it all, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird as she adjusted the final hem of a gown inspired by the very Ankara wrappers she once used to carry Mary on her back. Just moments ago, a notification had chimed on her phone. Anita Johnson had finally pulled the trigger, leaking a venomous smear campaign to the blogs that claimed Esther was a dropout who had manipulated her way into the Whitaker inner circle. For a second, the old shame threatened to swallow her, but then she felt a firm, warm hand on her shoulder. Victor was there, his eyes steady and filled with an unwavering pride that anchored her. He didn't need to say anything, he simply nodded toward the stage. As the lights dimmed and the rhythmic pulse of Afrobeat music swelled, the first model stepped out onto the runway. The collection Adira was a masterclass in resilience, bold, unapologetic silhouettes that blended the grit of the Lagos streets with the elegance of high couture. The audience, a sea of international editors and celebrities, fell into a stunned silence that quickly transformed into a low hum of awe. Every stitch told the story of a woman who had refused to remain invisible. When the final model completed her walk, Esther stepped out to take her bow, her eyes finding grandfather in the front row, his face lit with a rare, lucid joy. The standing ovation was deafening, a thunderous rejection of every lie Anita had tried to tell. The triumph didn't end on the stage. Before the night was over, the creative director of Vogue Africa approached Esther, offering a talent spotlight feature that would launch Adira into the global stratosphere. Later, under the soft glow of the Lagos skyline, Victor led Esther to a quiet corner where the city noise faded into a gentle murmur. He didn't offer her a studio or a scholarship this time. He offered her his life, sliding a gold ring onto her finger as he asked her to marry him. A year later, as Esther stood in her flagship Soho boutique with Mary, now a thriving 8-year-old, and Victor by her side, the struggle of the noodle stand felt like a distant dream. The family was finally whole, built on a foundation of kindness that the world could never tear down.